Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. And I think it should be a very, very interesting discussion tonight. I'd like to begin by saying that the University of Montana acknowledges that we are on the Aboriginal territory of the Salish and Kalispel people. We honor their history, their culture, and the path that they have shown in how to take care of this land that supports us all. The Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983, and it is to honor the longest serving U.S. ambassador to Japan, Mike Mansfield, and his wife, Maureen. Mike Mansfield certainly is one of the only, if not the only, ambassador to have served under both a Democrat and a Republican president. President Carter appointed him, and then President Reagan asked him to stay on. And he was highly respected in Japan for the voice that he had back in Washington with both presidents. We, at the Mansfield Center, we honor his legacy, a legacy of statesmanship, integrity, bipartisanship, and his global-minded approach. We foster globally minded leaders of integrity, and students are our primary focus through what we do. We try to bring differing voices together to explore the critical issues facing our world and recognize that there is more that unites us than divides us, although sometimes these days we're not too sure. We have over 200 people listening tonight, not only here in the Del Brown room, but we have people from Hungary, Mexico, Canada, and Japan, and about half of the U.S. states from east to west and north to south. So thank you all for joining us virtually and here in person. We are thrilled to have Sheila Smith, Dr. Sheila Smith, joining us here tonight. She's had a very busy schedule today. She began at 8 o'clock this morning with KGVO Talk Radio. She has met with students in Dr. Brian Dowdle's class and then met separately with students over lunch. And she's here tonight to share her expertise and her knowledge of Japan. You have her background written up in the program, and I believe also on our invited you, but she is the Johnny Marrow Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I've interacted with her for many years, and I can say that she is one of the nation's and really one of the world's foremost experts in Japanese politics and foreign policy. She has written a number of books, one of which is called Japan Rearmed: The Politics of Military Power. And I'm sure she will talk about some of that tonight, but for a country like Japan, which suffered a defeat in World War II and came out of it with a mandate through its constitution of peace, trying to reconcile military power with a premise of peace has been a continuing challenge. And Sheila points out very well some of the dilemmas that Japan has faced over the years. She's chair of the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission. She is an adjunct professor of Asian Studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And she also is on the advisory committee for the U.S.-Japan Network for the Future program of our sister Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation. So we are just thrilled to have her out here and spending her time particularly with students and with the public as well. Moderating tonight will be Dr. Brian Dowdle, who is the professor of Japanese in our Department of World Languages and Cultures here at the University of Montana. He is a PhD in Japanese literature from the University of Michigan, and I think it's really wonderful that he also is part of a group that mentors high school teachers in how to integrate Japanese studies into their teaching. So that is really a very wonderful thing that he does. So with that, I invite Sheila to take the mic and look forward to her talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for. Getting the tech right. Are we good? We're good. Okay, we got the go-ahead sign from the experts. Thank you, Joanna, for such a warm welcome. It is a privilege for me to be here. Can everybody hear me okay? All the way in the back? Yes, okay. Great. It's a privilege for me to be here at the Mansfield Center, to be here in Montana. This is not my first visit here. But every visit I've had, and I think somewhere around 6, 7, maybe 8 trips to the state, were all about Mike Mansfield and Maureen Mansfield and their legacy in the U.S.-Japan partnership. They are honored in Japan, but they're honored also among those of us who study the U.S.-Japan partnership and continue to work in that space in Washington and around the country. You have in your leadership here in Montana, somebody that is irreplaceable, really, in the history of our foreign policy and our relationship with Japan in particular. So thank you. I wanted to thank Sarah and Brian as well for a lovely day. It was a long day, and Sarah dutifully drove me all over town and made sure I was warm and comfortable, and I really appreciate that. You've taken very good care of me. I am delighted to be able to be here with you and the 200 or so people who are online. This is a conversation that I'm glad we can have here in Montana, but we can also engage with those of you out there around the world, Hungary and Japan and elsewhere. It's really exciting. I also want to say congratulations. You have now here at the University of Montana a new Japan chair who will be arriving this fall, and it will be many of us have been very excited to see the hiring process and to see Montana now begin to have the oomph of joining the rest of us and trying to make sure that the next generation of Americans are educated, not just about Japan and the US, but about all of us, Japan, the United States, and Asia, and the future that's ahead of us together there. I don't think there's a more deserving institution than the university where we sit for this new chair. So congratulations. Today I'm here, and I know this is a group of people. Some of you have experience in Japan. You've got professional experience. You've lived there. I know a lot of your students are studying Japanese language and culture and literature. But I thought I would share a little bit with you my thoughts on what is happening in the policy debate about our relationship with Japan. And remember, I sit quite squarely in Washington, D.C., and I'm looking out from that vantage point, but also talking to our policymakers, both our elected officials in Congress, as well as our executive branches. I've been there in that job now for several administrations, to try to think about how the U.S. and Japan can not only work together, but how they can work together better. And with the support of their people, both here in the United States and the people of Japan. It's really important, and I admire Mike Mansfield for this focus that he has had so clearly on our democracy and the importance of the cooperation between the democracy of the United States and the democracy of Japan. So my research has largely been not just about foreign policy, not just about how we live with the world out there, but how the people of Japan have influenced Japan's foreign policy choices. And Joanna made the reference, of course, to Japan's post-war debate over the role of its military in national goals. But there's a lot more of the issues that we should talk about in terms of how the Japanese people feel that their country, their nation should work with us and with other partners around the world. And I'm happy to talk about that. And hopefully Brian and I can get into more detail. But let me just sort of remind all of us that the partnership with Japan is now so comprehensive that sometimes we forget. It's not just a diplomatic relationship. It's not just a military alliance. It's not just an economic partnership. It's all of the above. But it also has really, really deep roots in the people-to-people relationship. And as Joanna kindly noted, I've worked in that space now for over a decade, helping sister city relationships, other kinds, student exchanges, memorandums of understanding between colleges, making sure that the people of both of our countries have the opportunity to become friends, to become partners, to learn about each other, to understand each other better, but also to see the way in which our shared values should help our governments understand where we can work together around the globe. So, some of you know this already, so forgive me. I'm going to give a couple of just high points here about the relationship, maybe already familiar to many of you, but we've got 50,000 men and women serving in uniform in Japan. And those are Army, Navy, Air Force. We have the only aircraft carrier that is deployed overseas, is home ported in Yokosuka, Japan, courtesy of the people of Japan. We have the largest air base in the Pacific at Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, Japan. So we have a fundamentally deep military to military relationship with Japan. We now have a space force in the United States that works with a space force, very small one, but growing, in Japan. The Japanese will send an astronaut to the moon with ours on the Artemis mission. And our astronauts, Japanese and American astronauts, will be using lunar surface equipment that was developed by JAXA, by the Japanese equivalent of NASA. So our partnership is broad. It goes all the way into space. Our economic partnership, is also deep. We are the fourth largest Japan is the fourth largest export market for American goods. Many people don't understand that. They think only Japanese goods come this way, but in fact, American goods go to Japan. It's a $309 billion trade relationship between the United States and Japan. Here is the important part, though, and maybe you've been reading the newspaper of late about Nippon Steel and all that politics, but Japan is the largest source of foreign direct investment in our economy. We have a $5 trillion level of foreign direct investment in this country, creating jobs, manufacturing opportunities, and others. Japan is 15% of the foreign direct investment in this country. Very important Japanese commitment to the future of American prosperity. Again, I mentioned the people to people, and some I know of you in the audience have mentioned to me that you have worked in the sister city relationship with Kumamoto, I believe. But the local governments work with each other, prefectures work with states, students. Many of you sitting in the back row will be going to Japan to study, and likewise, many of you have hosted Japanese students coming here to understand us better. We turn to each other in times of need. And I think that's another piece of the puzzle that we take for granted these days. But just to remind you, on 9/11, the Japanese government instantly responded with $25 million in support for New York City and the recovery from the attack on the United States. Similarly, Americans across the country, after Japan's great East Japan earthquake, was the first and the continuing supporter of recovery there, not only financially, but also our first responders on the ground from Alexandria, Virginia, from Texas, were sent over there immediately to help the Japanese deal with the tragedy. And today we've got massive fires in Los Angeles County, California, and the Japanese people have donated to our recovery in California. So we are there when something goes wrong in each of our countries, in each of our societies. And this is not necessarily a government-to-government response. It is also a people-to-people response. And I think it speaks volumes about how important this relationship is to the people of each of our countries. So, these are changing institutional relationships that we've had over decades of the post-war era. Sometimes we've had also, and Senator Mansfield was one of the people that dealt with some of these. We've also had some pretty critical moments of turmoil and disputes and issues we've had to resolve, and undoubtedly in the future we'll have differences. But what I wanted to talk about today is trying to think about this partnership, not just on its own, but to think about how it's adapting and changing to the world that we're now confronting. I think most of us here understand that it is a turbulent time in international politics. It is a turbulent time in the Indo-Pacific. It's a turbulent time domestically in our politics, a little bit so and lesser so, but still in Japan's politics, European politics. There is a widespread understanding that the peoples around the globe are becoming unhappy or less than persuaded that we have the right answers to problems. And so it's an important time for us to check in on where the alliance is. So I thought today what I'd tell you about a little is some of the specific geostrategic, so I'm going to be on the level of foreign policy at the moment, geostrategic challenges we've got and how we have responded in the last, I'd say, 5 to 8 years. But the global and regional context of this alliance is really what I want to emphasize, not just our bilateral, because we're very strong, I think, in our bilateral ties with Japan. But we now operate regionally in the Indo-Pacific, and we operate globally now with other partners in ways that were unimaginable, I think, when I started out my career, to be sure. But even a decade ago, I would have said, no, we're not going to go that far. It's going to be hard for Japan to do things like that with us. Not the case anymore. And in many ways, some of the changes that are happening inside Japan are happening without prompting from Washington. They are not done at the behest of the US government, but they are done because Japanese leaders and diplomats and people of Japan are beginning to see that they need to change because the world out there is a lot more dangerous for their interests than it used to be. So let me share some of those things. I don't want to be a dark, pessimistic sort of person, so I will try not to make it all very dark, but I just wanted to share with you that there are some serious challenges that are going to confront both Tokyo and Washington and us together with other allies in the years ahead. So let's start with the obvious place, are specific countries and their behaviors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about China and its behavior in the Indo-Pacific. I'll talk a little bit about Russia and its behavior in Europe. And obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about North Korea and how it has now become much more entwined with Moscow and what that means for Northeast Asia. I think you all understand that China's military capabilities have been rising. China has invested a considerable amount in its military over the last decade and a half. It has become far more assertive about maritime claims, not only territorial claims, and there are disputes with a number of countries, Japan, obviously, but with other countries as well. But it's also become much more assertive in terms of where it believes its maritime boundaries in the Indo-Pacific reside. So those are two separate issues, one territorial, the other maritime space in general. That is a map that I asked Sarah to provide. Not because I want to give you a geography lesson, but I want to just make sure that you understand the scope and the scale of the geographical impact of some of these changes that are underway. The one thing about the Indo-Pacific is it is two massive maritime spaces, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. And we call it the Indo-Pacific now because the US and Japan and other countries, Australia and India, now see the strategic swath of those two oceans as being the defining space to think about not only rising China, but also to think about how we can build coalitions to maintain open sea lanes, how we can build coalitions to maintain the kinds of open, free seas that we have come to rely on, not only for security reasons, but for economic reasons as well. The Chinese, of course, and we can talk about details. I'm going to go very broad brushstroke here, but we can talk about details later if you'd like. But there are two seas that are close to the Chinese border. One is the South China Sea, which you read about in the newspaper all the time. And that is the southern part that would affect the Philippines. It affects Taiwan and affects, the southern islands of Japan as well. The other is the East China Sea. And on the East China Sea, of course, you've got China and Korea and Japan. The two Koreas, I should say, North and South Korea. But those are how the Chinese see those as inland seas. And they would like the United States to be out of those areas. Thank you very much. If you talk to folks in the Pentagon, or if you yourself are a military thinker, you will recognize the term first island chain. That is a term that the Chinese have used, but we also use it now as well. And that first island chain off of the continental Asia is actually Japan and the Philippines on down. So for China, as it looks out to in the Pacific direction, it wants less activity up against its coastline, and it wants to push our maritime forces and alliances back beyond the first island chain. So that's the language there that they use. And that's pretty much where you see the Chinese, the PLA Navy, asserting its role, its presence, right? no fighting, no bullets, nothing drastic, but increasingly developing the capabilities to say, hey, these are our seas, not yours. Regardless, these are international waters, right? Most of it. And so that's where the contest over these maritime boundaries begins. There are also islands in here, and these are largely sovereignty disputes between Japan and China, Japan and Korea. There's disputes down in the Southeast China Sea as well, with the Philippines and China and other countries as well. There you find that the Chinese have developed maritime forces, again, not the Navy, but maritime forces that can travel at distance and are larger than our Coast Guard forces. So I hate to call them just a Coast Guard because they're actually quite significant capabilities. But their maritime forces are now in a tit for tat, kind of back and forth with the Philippines. Used to be Scarborough Shoal, now it's Second Thomas Shoal. Now it's moved to an island that's far closer to the main islands of the Philippines. So you've got a lot of pressure and pushback by Chinese maritime forces on some of those maritime countries. You had it also in the East China Sea. And Japan, of course, pushes back. Make no mistake, Japan has a significant naval capability and Air Force capability, so the Chinese can't really put that much pressure on Japan. And of course, as I noted, we have military presence there as well, and our Navy operates in and around Japan. So the Chinese can only push so far on Japanese territory to try on Japanese maritime boundaries. Nonetheless, what you have among the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries, is the desire to come to some kind of understanding with China about what is acceptable behavior, where are acceptable maritime boundaries. And only the Philippines has taken China to court under the UN Law of the Sea. They've tried to get arbitration over the differences of claims. Other ASEAN actors, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, have had an ongoing dialogue with the Chinese, and the Chinese have proposed a code of conduct to deal with behavior. That code of conduct, though, is very vague at times, doesn't necessarily change the behavior of Chinese maritime forces, and so it doesn't have teeth, if you forgive me for putting it in that language. There is no mechanism, if something goes wrong, to resolve a problem or a disparate claim. Where I think it's of late in the last couple of years, you start to see Chinese maritime presence in places beyond these traditional areas of dispute, is you now see the Chinese are operating up in the Arctic. And so in the North Pacific, you start to see the Chinese showing up off of Alaska. You started not that long ago, at the end of 2024, you saw Russians and Chinese operating together up off the coast of Alaska. Again, not in our territorial waters, but clearly in a region where the Chinese had not been active to date. The Chinese are not an Arctic power, but their association with the Russians have given them a little bit of an impetus towards greater collaboration there. If you've been, again, reading the newspapers, you'll notice it was a Chinese ship that severed cables offshore of Sweden and Finland. Not a military ship, a civil merchant ship, but nonetheless clearly identified with China. So you're starting to see Chinese behavior, maritime behavior, far more globally, that is more in consonance with Russian ideas and ambitions, but also in some ways in coordination with some of the goals that Russia has for demanding greater control over the Arctic and the Arctic resources. So again, you've got a China that's not just staying home in the Indo-Pacific. This is a China that has global aspirations, has military bases now moving across into the Indian Ocean and beyond. So it is something to pay attention to. This is a country that you don't have to think of it as a hostile nation, right, to us, or a belligerent nation for that matter. But China clearly has global ambition, and global maritime expression of that ambition is what we're increasingly being demonstrated. The second, obviously, point of reference is, and this I'll try to go quickly on because I know you've all read about it, we all know about it, which is Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is the first major power defeat, I think, of the norm of the post-war period, that territorial aggression is no longer acceptable in international politics. President Putin was quite clear that his ambition, first after the taking Crimea in 2014, that he was going to pursue control over Ukraine. I don't know about you. It didn't matter that the intelligence folks were telling us it was coming. I just couldn't believe that that would actually happen. And it goes to show you, maybe I'm a little naive, but I think it has another point here, and that is that we have absorbed that post-war norm, that it's no longer acceptable to take another country by force. You negotiate, you have territorial disputes, you have more relaxed borders. There's all kinds of ways in which we change those national sovereign lines. But invading them with a bunch of tanks is not what we think is acceptable anymore. And that's been true since the end of World War II. The fact that it happened in the middle of Europe, that it was European security that was under threat, I think was deeply astounding to the Europeans themselves. And for the Japanese, of course, if you talk to Japanese friends and partners, the idea that this could happen was incomprehensible to them, because the post-war norm embedded in the United Nations Charter had been so deeply internalized by the Japanese leaders and Japanese people that it was unconscionable. So what happened immediately in the wake of that is the UN Security Council was immobilized, obviously, because Russia sits there. So the G7 became the location for how do we respond to this? How do we act? And how do we act in concert with the violation of this norm? We can talk about NATO and the actual battle itself in a different way, but I want to focus on this idea of the norms and the institutions, post-war institutions. Japan did not respond so quickly to Crimea. Right? It didn't really feel that it was going to be a full-throttled participate in the sanctions on Russia at that point in time. For those of you who know Japan, you'll remember that Prime Minister Abe at the time was trying to engage President Putin in a dialogue about a peace treaty. Finally, after World War II, the final peace treaty between Japan and Russia. But when this happened, when Ukraine was invaded, you saw a very different Japan. A very different Japan that not only rushed to commit to the G7 sanctions and the expansion thereof as over time, but also to humanitarian relief for the Ukrainians who had to flee. And also, more recently, a commitment by the Japanese government, deeply supported by the Japanese people, to the reconstruction of Ukraine when peace finally arrives. So this is a Japan that was very different, very forward-leaning, and very engaged, not only with us, but with European partners as well, at supporting the rules-based order. And that's the language you heard from Prime Minister Kishida. That's the language you still, if you went to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, still the frame that the Japanese see for the reason for their response and their strong response to Russia's aggression. Now, there's more than that that's changed, and I'll just put this up as a little flag. Anybody wants to talk about it in the discussion, we can. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, therefore, has opened up a whole new set of challenges, I think, not just for the US and Japan, but for how we think about the post-war order itself. These large, big questions that we asked in the wake of World War II and we sustained over time, with some questioning on the United States' part at times, right? But I think there's another piece of the puzzle here that has yet to really come to the fore, but is coming, and that is this question of nuclear coercion. President Putin has very effectively also undermined our post-war understanding of the role of nuclear weapons as deterrent forces, not as forces used in battle, not as forces used to threaten the United States or NATO if it enters a conflict, right? That's what I mean by nuclear coercion, not the actual use of the weapon, but the threat of the use of the weapon, the normalizing of weapons of mass destruction. We had other reasons for not going into the battle, but I think President Biden also understood that underlying part of the American policy debate was whether or not we really wanted to go toe-to-toe in a nuclear era with a country that no longer believed in the nuclear norms that we had developed with the Soviet Union and then with Russia further along. This has implications, obviously, for the Indo-Pacific. It has implications for our allies in Northeast Asia, two of our allies who are non-nuclear powers. You've seen this come to the fore a little bit more clearly in South Korea and the political debate about their proliferation, less to the fore in the Japanese debate, because as many of you know, Japan was the only country against which nuclear weapons have been used, and the Japanese people have no interest in a debate over proliferation. However, it does introduce this new factor that we are going to have to think about as we look forward. The China-Russia relationship is the final piece here, the no limits partnership. And I would put under the rubric of this the Russian outreach to the DPRK, to Pyongyang, and Putin and Kim Jong-un's negotiation of a security alliance, a defense alliance that includes sending 10,000 North Korean troops to Ukraine. Right? Again, we can talk more about this if you'd like. The world is changing. It's changing fast. And some of our assumptions about the way things work are no longer actually the assumptions we should be making. We should at least be having conversations about the myriad impact that Russian aggression in Ukraine has had. Now, let me very quickly, because I realize I'm probably talking way too long and I apologize for that. That's the setup to the US-Japan response. And I'm going to go through a couple of these things that I think have been really, really important. I've been in this space of looking at the US-Japan alliance now for more decades than I'd like to confess publicly, but a long time, let's put it that way. And I have never seen the governments of the United States and Japan at a point of strategic convergence as close as it has been over the last 4 to 5 years, 6 years. This is a moment, I think, of really an amazing moment of strategic coordination between Tokyo and Washington. And I think I put it out there simply to say it's extraordinary, but we shouldn't take it for granted, right? Abe Shinzo, I think, was the architect of an idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific, an idea that was adopted and absorbed by our government. This was the Trump administration, first Trump administration, embraced this idea of thinking not just as East Asia, but of thinking of this strategic region, and thinking about it not just in military terms, but thinking it also in economic, commercial, and technological innovation as well. You've got some amazing new relationships that have emerged out of this strategic concept. You've got the Quad, where the leaders of Japan, the United States, Australia, India met regularly, starting with the first year of the Biden administration. It became a leaders meeting. And for those of you outside of Washington, a leaders meeting means that the government snapped to attention. If you have a presidential meeting with another leader, your government is ready and committed to do whatever gets agreed to at the table. So it really elevates. That's why you don't have a lot of them, actually. But it really elevates the strategic agenda when you have 4 leaders sitting at the table every year in each other's countries, defining what they're going to do together in the Indo-Pacific. It was really quite remarkable. It has been quite remarkable. And I'm very happy. I was very happy to see the foreign ministers of these 4 countries gather at the inauguration to continue that dialogue. I don't mind if it's not the presidents or the prime ministers and it's the foreign ministers, but I think the Quad offers us great opportunity with other partners. Our European allies have also become very familiar and very close partners of our Indo-Pacific allies. And that was obviously the opportunity that Russia offered, the Russian invasion offered. So you've got very networks security across Indo-Pacific, now across the globe. US, Japan, Australia do maritime exercises. US, Japan, India do Malabar maritime exercises. Now the US, Japan, and the Philippines are doing exercises together, all of which signal to Beijing that this is not one country alone that will respond if there's pressure or aggression, but that there's networks now of collaboration. So it's a very important signal. It's not necessarily we're on the verge of war. It's not that at all. It's a signal that, look, we're paying attention, and you can't pick off one of us at a time. We are going to be there if there's aggression or if there's any kind of pressure tactics. The US-Japan ROK relationship has also been massively reinvigorated. Again, we can talk about that in detail if you'd like. On the Japanese side, and this is partly in my book that Joanna so kindly referenced, but the self-defense forces now have become a normalized part of these strategic relationships. Those of you who know your World War II history will be surprised, but the Japanese Air Force goes to the Philippines. lands in the Philippines and does Air Force exercises with the Philippine Air Force. They train Philippine pilots, similarly with the Navy. So you've got an embrace in not all, but many countries of Southeast Asia of this more active Japanese role in peacetime of helping to build capacity, maritime, air, and other kinds of capacities for countries that have smaller militaries. Finally, let me just highlight some of the ways in which Japan and the United States now have also expanded their economic strategic cooperation. So in the economic domain, our trade disputes are there's still some trade issues, don't get me wrong. But now in the economic domain, most of the time our governments are talking with these other partners, but they're talking about how do we respond as a coalition against economic coercion by China. Japan itself faced that when there was a blow up over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Rare earth materials, funny enough, stopped exiting Chinese ports, something that Japanese manufacturers are very dependent on. But so did the South Koreans. When the United States military put the Theater High Altitude Ballistic Missile System in Korea, the Chinese responded with economic sanctions against the company whose land it was. Australia had the temerity to say it wanted the WHO to investigate the origins of the COVID-19 virus. China responded with a long list of 10 economic measures it was taking in response, one of which was to stop buying Australian wine. Many people in Washington said, that's okay, we'll buy it, we'll buy it. But as you know, what the real economic impact was the minerals and the raw materials and minerals from Australia. So Australia suffered significant economic damage as a result of that decision. We are also thinking of how do we make our supply chains more resilient? How do we diversify where and what kind of parts we get, where we build component parts in the medical field in particular post-pandemic, but in other areas as well. We have a new word, friend shoring. We have people coming and bringing their plants with semiconductors and other kinds of technologies into American territory to be manufactured here. Similarly, Japan now has 2 or 3, maybe 4 now, new semiconductor plants of TSMC, and Samsung has an R&D facility in Yokohama. So you're seeing friendshoring. It's not just us. Japan is doing it. The Europeans are doing it. Manufacturing, global manufacturing is now being reorganized so that it is done among allied nations in a way where we can supply each other should we need it, should there be coercion against any of us. And Japan has got its whole new set of laws of economic security, a new thing for the Japanese government and the Japanese private sector and the Japanese people. And it ranges from cyber security measures for critical infrastructure, for trains, for airports, things like that, all the way to trying to replicate a committee that will look at foreign direct investment in Japan, the same way we have a CFIUS oversight mechanism of many agencies look at foreign direct investment that comes to the United States and make sure it doesn't have national security implications for us. So Japan is taking a page out of our book, and I think they're going to be looking much, much more closely at the way that their private sectors are dealing with China. But it isn't just China. What's ahead? 3 things, very briefly. We have these deepening networks of security cooperation, and I won't, belabor the point. Very, very important that we maintain them. This is not a moment in time when the United States can afford to act alone, and we certainly can't protect our own security, much less be able to protect our allies and make sure that the world is the kind of world where we are all feeling safe, either in terms of military pressure or economic pressure. Second thing, and this is the 2025, you can see it, it's coming. We are going to have changes in the way our 2 militaries, US and Japan, operate together. For the first time in the post-war period, Japan will be creating a joint permanent operational command. All 3 of its services will be integrated if they have to use force, and let's hope they don't. They will have a joint commander who will respond rather than 3 separate services. Our US forces, Japan, will be reorganized also to have an operational mission that will match Japanese priorities and will be able to work effectively with that. Japan has committed by 2027 to spend 2% of its GDP on its national security. 2% of Japanese GDP is double what it was spending several years ago. It's a massive increase in investment in military power and capability, and we should see that completed by 2027. Similarly, we are going to have to up our game in terms of military investments, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Our new economic policies, I think, for the incoming administration, for me, remain the biggest question mark, not just in our cooperation and strategic relationship with Japan, but with all of our allies, in fact. Until we see how the Trump administration develops its economic priorities, especially on trade, we'll have foreign direct investment implications as well, but we'll also begin to change the rules if we are not careful. The United States could become the revisionist power in changing the global economic system, and that is something I won't predict because we don't know yet how that's going to move forward. But I think if Japan or Japanese policymakers and private sector leaders have one thing right now that they're focused on like a laser beam, it is the American economic priorities and the American economic trade practices that they are most interested in learning more about as this administration moves forward. We will have to be careful that we are not building a world that we don't want to live in. And our allies don't necessarily have to have the last say when it comes to trade. Trade has always been a negotiated outcome, especially with some of our allies who are competitive with us in certain sectors. But if we are going to have a relationship of strategic competition that includes the United States and its allies in coalition, we're going to have to think very carefully about the priorities that we put forward and make sure that the economic security piece of our strategy continues to be strong and continues to be built alongside our partners. We stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sheila Smith. That was really quite interesting. You've touched on a number of topics. I don't believe that we'll have time to circle back to all of them, but thank you once again for joining us today. I'd also like to thank those of you who have come out on such a cold night and those who are joining us online. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to Joanna Shelton, for her work on the Mansfield Center board in making tonight's meeting possible and inviting Sheila to come visit us today. So I had a wonderful opportunity today to have Sheila visit our students, and she asked a number of great questions, and I started doing some background research to maybe try and answer them. And what I realized is that the US-Japan relationship and the Montana-Japan relationship is much older than we necessarily think of. Yes, we think of Mike Mansfield serving as the ambassador from the late 70s through the late 80s, and the wonderful relationship we've had with our sister prefecture, Kumamoto. And it was thanks to that friendship that really the Japanese language program here at the University of Montana got started through a gift from the Tsukasa Karashima Foundation. But looking back, there's relationships that existed before that. In fact, Mike Mansfield was a professor here at the University of Montana back in the 30s, and he taught courses on Japanese culture then. And moving even farther back, interestingly enough, in 1909, the largest delegation from Japan, the Japanese Commercial Commission to the United States, including basically a who's who's list of everyone who's important in Japanese business, came to the US to meet with the US president, and they traveled through Missoula on their way to Butte, America. And they were going to Butte partially as economic rivals. They were looking at the Anaconda Copper Company, and they had representatives from the Ashio Copper Company. But more than rivals, they were looking to work together to solve some of the problems related to copper mining, especially the industrial and environmental problems. And unfortunately, neither of them solved those problems soon enough. And we still today have some environmental issues related to that. But that cooperation, that spirit of cooperation, I think is something that unites us and goes quite a ways back. Here at the University of Montana, the Japanese language program is the second largest language major. Students across the state are interested in Japanese. And in fact, many of them don't know that Japanese popular culture is from Japan until they're a little bit older. It's a very familiar country in a way that 50 years ago, 100 years ago, no one would have thought possible. And this connection between people to people is also supplemented, as was mentioned, with companies. And just last week, the Montana Department of Commerce held a reception on the Montana-Japan partnership. And it was hosted by Montana Lieutenant Governor and the Japanese Consulate General, Iori Makoto. According to KPAX, last year, Japan purchased $240 million of imports from Montana in wheat, coal, and other goods. And we mentioned foreign direct investment in Montana. 15% of the US investment comes from Japan. And I was like, well, where are the Japanese companies here in Montana? And they're really hard to see because they have names like Columbia Grain, Kraft Malt, Helena Agricultural Enterprises, Pasta Montana.
My favorite.
Yes. And those are all part of Japanese corporations that have invested here in the state, along with Taisei Techno and Mitsui Komatsu Heavy Industry in Billings. Yeah. And this is a point of a priority for the state of Montana, the Governor Gianforte, the Department of Commerce, the Montana World Trade Center. And the Montana World Trade Center, by the way, has a wonderful website for looking up information if you have to give a talk the night of about direct investment. They have a map where you can see each of the counties in the state and which Japanese and which foreign companies have invested. And it's quite amazing to see how deeply integrated into our economy, both agricultural and more of the harder industries Japan has become. And so this kind of brings us back to the issue of economics. And you mentioned the Nippon Steel, US Steel issue that's been in the news lately. And it seems to connect back to the kind of rules-based order that you mentioned and the question about who's going to be revising that. Can you give us a little bit more background on that debate and kind of what's at stake there beyond just steel?
So the Nippon Steel, I mean, I am not an expert in the steel industry, so please don't mistake me for somebody who can help you understand steel production globally. But I also had to prepare for an interview at one point, and I was madly Googling. Nippon Steel is the fourth largest steel manufacturer in the world. US Steel is somewhere, I think it's 27th. Used to be much bigger, but it's not financially in the same position it used to be. But that is true generally of the American steel industry. You've got newcomers, right? You've got the Japanese, which have very sophisticated and niche parts of steel production, like many industries in Japan. But you've got the Koreans as well, manufacturing steel. You've got Europeans. But then China has become the major source of global production of steel. In fact, one of the big conversations or irritations, whichever word you prefer, we have with the Chinese, and our Secretary Yellen had this conversation when she visited China, was the overproduction of steel and of the flooding of global markets by Chinese steel that had been subsidized by the Chinese government for production. Therefore, the trade issue is this question of equity and fairness in trade. But I think what Nippon Steel was hoping was that it would get a foothold in the American market. It would purchase an American steel company that was in difficulty. It was in a traditional town of Pittsburgh. They wanted to bring $14 billion to the proposition. I mean, it's not an inconsequential purchase, right? Not just one little company, right? It's big. But also Nippon Steel wanted to participate in the US market because why? We have an infrastructure, that has begun to really try to reinvigorate American infrastructure, roads, bridges, all kinds of things. And so the purchasing of steel in the United States was something that Nippon Steel also was interested in. But there are tariffs in place because during the first Trump administration, there are tariffs on certain kinds of Japanese steel. So you see how these economic relations get all twisted up in each other. But the reality was that this was this purchase began 6 months before we entered into a presidential election year. And I don't know the details of the deal, and I'm not proposing it's a good deal, bad deal, but somehow the deal didn't fully engage the Steelworkers Union, and that was a problem. And so there were different problems with the deal itself that then got exaggerated and exacerbated by the political mood of our presidential election year. And you had a competition between the candidates, right? President Trump, now President Trump, saying, I'll support the steelworkers. We don't want foreign purchase. And then, of course, the President Biden at the time followed suit. So both presidential candidates, and then, you know, Vice President Harris continued that position herself as well, basically said that they were against it. Now, I mentioned CFIUS, which is a committee of multiple agencies of the U.S. government, Treasury, USTR, Department of Defense, Department of State, and there's a couple of other that I can't remember at the moment. Anyway, it's an interagency process of reviewing the purchase of an American company by a foreign entity, a foreign company. And they investigate whether or not this would present a national security risk. So the CFIUS process was ongoing, and yet you had two presidential candidates who had already opposed the purchase based on national security. So there is this disconnect between the process by which our government reviews these deals and ultimately the politics of an election year. The President Biden said no, thank you, but they basically kicked the can down the road with the review process to come out with its conclusion after the election was over. But when President Biden made his comment that he didn't support the purchase, Keidanren, which is the kind of Federation of Japanese companies, for the first time to my knowledge, basically said, I hope that the United States is following the rule of law as it reviews this deal, and that, you know, Japanese companies will be watching carefully to make sure that the rule of law is respected in this particular issue. Now, they didn't come out and say we support Nippon Steel. They didn't do anything like that, but they were worried about the politicization of the issue. When the decision was made, CFIUS couldn't come to a consensus agreement, by the way. Usually CFIUS has a unified consensus position, but they couldn't. So they bumped it up to the president, and President Biden ultimately made the final decision that this would affect American national security. And so he was denying the deal. We can debate whether that's a good decision, bad decision, but that's what he did. And it prompted a very strong Japanese reaction. The prime minister spoke out, the Ministry of Foreign of Economics and Trade spoke out, but so did again Keidanren and Keizai Doyukai, which is a separate business organization. Both of them spoke out about whether or not Japanese foreign direct investment in the United States would be governed by the rule of law. And so the flag that's being flown here is, can we trust you as an environment in which politics won't determine who gets to buy which company or business practices generally? And will you really stand up to the premises that we thought the American market were being governed by? Pretty strong signal.
That is an interesting signal. What, if we could take this maybe one step below the business organizations back to the people-to-people connections in the relationship between the United States and Japan. Do you have a sense of how this is being perceived by the average person on the street in Japan?
Well, in Japan, and I know some of you may have been in Japan or maybe Japanese and can speak to this as well, but I'm watching from Washington on my Japanese programming and NHK and watching online. It has gotten an awful lot of media attention. It's been discussed almost daily since the President Biden made that decision. Nippon Steel is going to sue because they believe that this is not a legal decision. It's not within the realm of commercial law here in the United States. So there's ongoing, the private sector level. The public, the media is quite focused on, is this truly a good alliance? Is this a relationship that we can trust? Why are we being considered as an adversary when we are a close ally of the United States? I don't know that from the business point of view, there's a lot of public commentary, but it hasn't been helped by the fact that there's an American steel company who offered, I don't know, 2/3 of the price of Nippon Steel. I can't remember exactly the detail. And that CEO has been quite happily in the public eye, saying, you know, obviously the Japanese didn't learn from World War II. Now that you can guarantee hit the headlines in Japan. That was broadcast on the national and NHK and all the way across public broadcasting. So there is a sense here that this is creating ill feeling. I don't know how the Trump administration is going to respond to this issue, if it will even come up again, or they will deal with it as settled by President Biden. I don't know, but it has not been a proud moment, I think, for managing the U.S.-Japan relationship at the people-to-people level.
Thank you. This question of domestic politics and international relations is certainly a thorny one. And with the first Trump administration, Japan seemed to have a very good relationship working with him. Do you get a sense that the second Trump administration will continue to have some of the same policies, or maybe since we can't see the future, how is Japan responding to that? What types of questions are they asking, and what hopes do they have or strategies that they might be taking to manage their relationship?
So the first Trump administration, one of the facilitating variables for the Japan-US relationship was former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. And you guys may not remember the details, so I'll just run through quickly. Abe went to see Trump as president-elect when he was still in Trump Tower in New York, on his way to an APEC meeting when President Obama was at APEC and in South America. He brought him a nice golf club. I believe it was gold to match Trump Tower, maybe. Anyway, he had a connection. He went. It's a little unprecedented and undiplomatic, but he went. And it could have gone either way, frankly. But it did go well for the personal relationship between Abe Shinzo and Trump. And I think you have to remember then, I'm not sure I know what President Trump was thinking at the time, but President-elect Trump was, I think, a little surprised that he'd actually won in Trump 1.0. So it was in an interval when there wasn't a lot of preparation. There wasn't the normal sense that there was going to be a transition. There was a transition team. And I think there was a certain level of personal connection that Abe made with Donald Trump that put the president at ease in a way. He had to go to NATO. He had a meeting in Europe. And I think Prime Minister Abe actually was a very strong supporter of helping him navigate a world that he was actually not used to and couldn't predict, and was a little bit maybe ill at ease in, I don't know. But he was also, remember at that time is we didn't have a president in South Korea. Park Geun-hye had been indicted. And so you had another ally in Northeast Asia who might have fed into the early process of talking to President Trump. So the other thing was that Prime Minister Abe really got to talk an awful lot about North Korea, about the balance of power in Northeast Asia, about China. So he became a little bit of his Asia advisor in a sense, I think, because there was a lot of access between the two leaders. So I think the first Trump administration, you still had a trade problem because the president was very focused on tariffs and renegotiating a trade deal with Japan. Abe, of course, wanted the Trans-Pacific Partnership. President Trump did not. But they overcame that and did a bilateral trade agreement on goods that wasn't terribly harmful. But you also had burden sharing issues. And so the Japanese government purchased 104 F-35s off the shelf from Lockheed Martin at a phenomenal price tag that I don't even know what it is. But normally that would have been a foreign military sales where they would have been partly produced in Japan. There would have been a little bit more accommodation of that kind of partnership with Mitsubishi. That didn't happen because they wanted they wanted big, it affected the trade balance as well. So I think you had an administration in Japan that managed to navigate in a way. And in a sense, I think President Trump at the time didn't see Japan as a huge problem. It wasn't the ally, the European renegotiating agreement, and managed to navigate that relatively unscathed. This time will be different. So there's both still the trade and the burden sharing issue. Under this presidency, Japan will have to renegotiate a 5-year host nation support agreement with Japan and the United States. This is where Japanese pay supporting costs for the presence of our troops in Japan, and maintenance costs for our naval ships, et cetera, et cetera. So it will be a little bit under pressure that way. But really, I think the spillover effects of some of these bigger systemic decisions by the Trump administration are really going to be what the Japanese are going to have to deal with, whether it's the alliance, whether President Trump feels, as President Biden did, that we ought to do everything to defend and deter aggression against Taiwan. We could have a 3-hour conversation about Taiwan, actually. But these are the world is a different place today. We've got a war in Europe. We have a ceasefire in the Middle East, but we have not quite clear what is coming after that. And we've still got Chinese presence and pressure on their neighbors, and including pressure on Taiwan. So the geostrategic decisions of the president will affect Japan's own calculus on its security, and obviously the tariffs are going to affect how Japan organizes its trade with us. Mexico and Canada, you'll remember, is where a lot of autos are made.
Mhm.
That's where the Japanese have factories and plants and investments. Auto parts will be very badly affected if that relationship incurs 25% tariffs, what the president's threatening. So the economic may not be directed at Japan, but many of our decisions will ultimately affect our partnership.
Through the ripple effect and carry on that way. You've mentioned a few times U.S. bases in Japan, and I think World War II is still a large issue shaping kind of the memory of U.S. and Japan relations. How did we go from World War II, where we were fighting against Japan, to now having 80 years later, still having bases in Japan and having different training exercises that you've mentioned? Like, what is the nature of the U.S.-Japan alliance, and what's some historical background on that?
So this is a long story. I'll try to make it brief. So in 1951, the United States led a multilateral negotiation of peace, the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which we discussed in your class today, that really restored Japanese sovereignty. So the U.S.-led occupation ended. And alongside that was a security agreement, which allowed the basing of U.S. forces. It wasn't a mutual agreement. It was simply a security agreement that would allow the continued presence of U.S. forces on Japanese territory. Remember, too, 1951, what's going on? There's a war next door in Korea. So this is the moment when the Cold War is beginning to look like it might be a hot war. We weren't even using the vocabulary Cold War at that point in time, right? It was a threshold moment. Lots of citizen discomfort with the continued presence of forces that the Japanese people saw as occupation forces, not as forces there to help them. So lots of incidents. And again, I can talk about, I'm writing about it now, so I could probably talk about more detail than you'd like to hear about that period. But it was a very difficult period for the Japanese government from their own population. And so that's what prompted the Japanese government to ask the United States to renegotiate the bilateral security treaty. Very tumultuous. You had people, the US and Japanese governments did this, and two things happened in the treaty. One is Article 5, which we all take for granted today. It's part of NATO agreement. It's part of our US ROK agreement. But Article 5 protections commit the United States to assist in deterring aggression and, if necessary, in defending our allies. So anytime you hear Article 5 protections, it is the United States' commitment to deter aggression or to help our ally. But Article 6 then included the ability of the United States to use facilities and bases on Japanese territory for the purpose of the security of the Far East. So this is Korea, Taiwan, right? Not just for Japanese security, but for the broader regional stability. So that's what went into the 1960 treaty, still exists today. Either country with a year could abrogate that treaty and say, thank you very much, we're done. So just so you know, but there it sits, and that's the premise upon which we have those troops there. There's one more premise, though, it's really important from the Japanese government's point of view. They wanted that Article 5 protection. It was not in the first, it was a basing agreement the first time around. The United States didn't make any commitment to help Japan. By 60, they understood that they would never have the military capability to deal with the PRC, with the USSR, and with their other situations around them. So they asked for American aid in their defenses. The Japanese government also asked to be consulted on any changes in American deployments. And they were thinking here, obviously, the introduction of nuclear weapons or capabilities. They were thinking of any mass changes in the deployment pattern, either mass forces coming in or large divisions going out. They wanted to be asked for permission first. And then the third one, a very important one, is they wanted to be consulted and they wanted to give approval or disapproval of the use of those forces for combat in any third country. So that's what's known. It never became in the treaty language. It became a memorandum attached to the treaty. It's called the prior consultation mechanism, and it outlines the obligation of the United States government to consult with the government of Japan on any of those three issues. We've never had to use it, but small little factoid for you to remember is the first Trump administration was the first time the Japanese government had to remind the US government that the prior consultation mechanism existed. And that's when the fire and fury talks, you guys were probably, for you younger students, you probably don't remember, but for all of us who are of a certain age, will remember, there was fire and fury, there was mobilization, we might go to war with North Korea. There was serious talk of a conflagration on in the Korean Peninsula, and the Japanese government quietly knocked on the door of the Trump administration and said, let me show you again the prior consultation mechanism. You can't do anything from our bases without our consent. So again, to my knowledge, that's the only time the US government had to be reminded of that premise.
And you said that those agreements can be removed after a year.
Yep. So in the treaty itself, there's a 1-year abrogation clause.
After 1 year. How much would you say these treaties and kind of the protection, the US nuclear umbrella, allowed Japan not to develop nuclear weapons or encourage them not to develop nuclear weapons versus their own horrific experiences in World War II that created a public distaste for developing nuclear weapons? I don't know if that's
So that's,
balanced there.
this is the thing about policy, social science, history. You can't roll the tape back and try it this way and then try it that way. So it's hard to, I think it's hard to disentangle. But I will say that Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru and subsequent conservative Japanese cabinets have all understood that having the treaty with the United States deters, several nuclear powers that are sitting on just out over the corner or over the sea from Japan. So Japan lives in a nuclear neighborhood and has done since the Chinese developed capabilities in the 60s. Now North Korea has missiles that reach Japan, and it too probably has that capability. But it's hard to know. I think if you look at public opinion polling in the Japanese cabinet, polls regularly on this issue, should Japan have or not have, and you rarely get a very large number for yes, Japan should acquire nuclear weapons. Every now and then you'll get a kind of controversial article in a journal says, if we want to be secure, we shouldn't rely on the Americans. We should get nuclear weapons. But if you're thinking about the policymakers and or the general public, there's very little appetite in Japan for having that conversation. Again, unlike South Korea.
Well, thank you. We have some time now to invite questions from the audience. And we have a mic going around. Oh, my mic's going around. Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
You are going
I feel
around.
like Phil Donahue.
It's really great to see you, and thank you so much. I think it was an amazing speech, and I'd like to give you a clap before I ask him.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing your expertise. It's surreal that I'm seeing you out of DC, so it's just bizarre. Welcome to my home state.
Thank you.
One of the things I'm looking at, I love that you've put up this map of East Asia and Oceania up here, because it really is a frame of reference that tells us the way the rest of the world sees itself. And I think it's really important to see it through the frame of the other. One of the things that's striking me as I'm looking at this map that I've never really considered before, you've touched on it a little bit, is how close Japan is to Russia. And can you talk from a geostrategic? I've never really noticed that before.
Yes.
Can you expand on that? That's my question.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm so glad you asked. I hope you guys can stay for a couple of hours this evening. So I had a wonderful opportunity last year. I'm writing a book about the erosion of the post-war order in Northeast Asia. So I'm looking at Japan, Korea, Taiwan, but I'm really looking at some of the normative underpinnings of the post-war order, going back to the treaties, but also how domestic groups have challenged some of those compromises that were made way back when in the 50s. And so one of the things I've never done is I've never gone to have a look at the Northern Territories. So here I come. So even people like me who study this all the time and look at the map all the time, right? And you think, oh, the Northern Territories are just up there in Hokkaido. Yes, 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 yes. I think I know what you're talking about, but I didn't. So I went, I don't have a pointer and I'm not that tall, but if you go all the way to, because everybody recognizes Hokkaido as the big fourth island at the top of in Japan. You'll see pink then becomes Russia up there. So Hokkaido has a little tiny peninsula, and off of that peninsula, I could, if in the wintertime it's frozen. First of all, it's the Sea of Okhotsk on that in that direction. It's not the Pacific anymore. It's the Sea of Okhotsk, which is a Russian sea, right? Inland sea. It freezes in the winter, and you can walk to the Habamai Islands. They're very flat. They're 4, 5, 6, 7, depending on which one you're talking about, kilometers away. Quite honestly, if you could stand the cold and the freezing and the wind, you could walk to Habamai, which is one of the four islands that the Japanese claim are theirs. You can see the bigger islands, and Kunashiri and Etorofu are big volcanic islands. So they're long, they've got mountains in the middle. The topography looks a lot like other volcanic islands in the Pacific, north or south. But here's the thing, the channel between the Sea of Okhotsk, so that's that sea you guys can read all the way up there between the pink. Sakhalin is one on the left, and then Kamchatka Peninsula, Russia comes down. That sea there is frigid and cold. And the channel between the northern islands, or the northern territories, as Japan refers to them, the southern Kurils, right? The channel is very shallow. The Japanese Navy does not go there. So fishermen will go and sometimes get stuck, depending on the tides or the ice flow. The Coast Guard has an ice cutter up there. That's the biggest ship that the Japanese government maintains up there. It's a large, serious ice cutter, often has to rescue fishermen, Russian or Japanese. There have been Russians who have left those islands and swam to Hokkaido, sturdy Russians. But then they're swimming 15 kilometers, right? But it's very close. It's very, very close. I joke to my friends in DC, and you'll forgive me for, and I said, I'm going up to northern Hokkaido so I can see the Russians from my front porch. And I thought I was being funny. I went to the tip of the place where you look out. I saw the Russian security guards, the border patrol, not the military again, the border patrol. They had helicopters operating off of one of the islands Japan claims, right? And then there were barracks where they lived. And then there was a small frigate. I mean, I guess frigate would be the right word in terms of size of the ship. It was bigger than the Japanese Coast Guard ships that I visited. But yeah, the Russian border service is there. The FBS is there. And there's more of them. And the Russians have put missiles in Etorofu. Etorofu is not visible from with the naked eye from that coast, what I was telling you about. But Etorofu is probably 20 to 25 kilometers, maybe 30, 35 at max. And now they have anti-ship and other kinds of missiles. So when I went back to Tokyo, I asked a retired admiral in the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, I said, you guys aren't interested in what they're doing up there? And he said, A, it's too shallow. And B, we'd have to be very, very close to our coastline to be sure we weren't inviting a response. So it's an area of territory, maritime, and I'm not saying this to criticize the Japanese self-defense forces. They're being very, very prudent. Of course, somebody in your class said that they had been in Chitose. A student had done a homestay in Chitose, which is an Air Force base, big Japanese Air Force base up in central Hokkaido there. So they've got a lot of firepower. The Japanese have a lot of firepower out there because that's their northern border, and the Russians test them all the time. Last point. the Russians have been organizing Vostok exercises. Vostok is basically a defensive exercise that they run from the inner part of Sakhalin across to the Kurils and back out again. And they've been doing it with the Chinese. They've invited the Chinese in. So now you've got, in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's not just a diplomatic, sanctions policy and a Russian reaction to sanctions policy. Now you've got an invigoration of what's happening in the rest of the Japanese Inland Sea, which is the Russians and the Chinese are increasingly exercising militarily together. So they are there. They've invited the Chinese in there to help defend the Russian homeland. And there's no, I'll say it again, there is no peace treaty between Japan, but they have a diplomatic agreement. There's a diplomatic mission in Tokyo. I don't want to overemphasize the no peace treaty, but because they can't solve this territorial problem, they can't conclude a peace treaty finally to end World War II. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah. You can ask. No, you can shout out. You go ahead. Whoop, I'll come back. Yep.
You want me to go?
Yes, please.
Okay. Could you talk about Japan's current energy portfolio and to what extent are they independent and who do they depend upon for energy?
I stand up. I'm sorry, I'm going to stand up because I can't see you in the back there. Is that okay? I am not able to give you exact numbers, but 90% of Japanese oil is 98%, 96 to 98, somewhere in there, is the Japanese dependency on overseas oil. They're completely dependent on external sources of oil and gas. There has been some discovery of methane gas. There is some use of coal. There's hydroelectric power. So they run the gamut. There's been increased investment in renewable energy. So the same thing we would do, wind, solar, et cetera. Their nuclear industry, of course, was affected after the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake. The Japanese public became very concerned about safety at nuclear plants. Many of Japanese nuclear plants are aging, so they're 70s or older, not older, they're the 70s or so. But so you've got a real kind of dilemma for the Japanese. They're deeply dependent on that. The one thing that will be positive for the Japanese and the new Trump administration is that the export licensing for LNG and other kind of gas from the United States will then open up for the Japanese because there was a halt during the Biden folks. But Russia, again, right after 2011, Sakhalin is that pink island that's kind of standing up there on the left-hand side on top of Hokkaido. They sent Japan about 9%. They were providing about 9% of LNG after the 2011 earthquake. That has stopped. The sanctions have brought an end to that. Also on Sakhalin, you've got Mitsui, and I think there's another Japanese company that was in a consortium run by Shell for exploitation of oil, also from Sakhalin. Shell pulled out after the invasion of Ukraine. Now it's Gazprom, so it's the Russians, and the Mitsui and them are still there, but nervously still there. Can't collect any profits from it, but they have not been nationalized. They haven't been taken by the Gazprom, but they're not getting any money out of the investment either. But Japanese energy dependence is very, very high. So anything that we do with Japan in oil and gas would be deeply appreciated to offset the dependence elsewhere. Most of the dependence is in the Middle East, which opens up, again, for this map, it opens up the Straits of Malacca and sea lanes and the vulnerability of sea lanes to the Chinese influence, things like that. So again, you're looking at a Japan that would really appreciate open seas, open trading partners, preferences, and things like that. So if the world changes in the direction of protectionism, et cetera, this will have a very high consequence for Japan. We'll come back before we finish.
It's weird to hear. Thank you for speaking. Your level of specificity is truly unique. I'd be curious to hear, as China becomes more assertive and powerful in world affairs, do you view the best response as the United States growing American economic and political and military power in its own right, or America's allies stepping up and growing their own power in global affairs? Which is a more effective response?
All of the above. So I think, the challenge for the United States is that, and you'll hear this out of, or you heard it out of our Secretary of Defense, Austin, in the Biden administration. China is our near peer competitor. And if you look, our Pentagon looks forward, as our industry looks forward, it's China that's going to give us the biggest run for our money, whether it's technological innovation, whether it's trading partners, whether it's the ability of China to leverage its economic power for strategic gain. It's China we're worried about. And the Chinese, to be fair, have developed technologically in ways that could very easily outstrip American technological capacity. Largely, of course, it has the advantage of the state can organize the capital and the manufacturing in a way that the state wants it to go. So we are not a government or an economy run by our government. So that is, call it an advantage in some ways, but it helps China define its strategic interests and then implement it in a way that we simply don't in a free society. So there's lots of reasons to know to look ahead and understand that we're going to have China as a competitor for a long time to come. Does it have to be a hostile competition? No, it doesn't. Is it a competition that we will be able to win on our own? Not a bet I'd be interested in taking, honestly. I would much rather do it with our friends and partners. If you flip that around, our friends and partners will need us, absolutely. And so whether it's the Europeans or Japan or South Korea, Australia, these are countries that want to compete technologically, want to think about the next threshold of technological innovation, but also defense military innovation together with us, and want to partner and pony up resources and scientific knowledge and expertise. I think that's the game plan we should follow. That's my preference. Will we lose otherwise if we don't? Don't know. Is American society ready to compete with China to the degree it would require us to reorganize? We would have to reorganize our private sector for that goal. And that would mean compromising a lot of the values that I think many people hold dear in this country. We are not at war, right? We are in peacetime. So I like the idea of building partnerships, developing complementary resources, thinking this problem through with our friends. I like that approach best, but that's my answer, if that helps.
Could you talk just a little bit about the relationship between Japan and Korea, especially in light of the recent developments with the president? Yes.
Yes. So many of you are aware of this, but Japan and South Korea have a long-standing political. There's many political irritants in the relationship. Let me rephrase that. Some of which have to do with historical memory and the way in which historical memory has not been addressed in the eyes of many Koreans adequately by the Japanese. In the eyes of many Japanese, the idea that the Koreans keep asking for this problem to get readdressed and addressed and negotiated and renegotiated is also irritating to the Japanese. So you've got deep domestic politics on both sides around this question of fair accountability and responsibility for the colonization of Korea by Japan. Now, as you all know, in international law, you can talk about reparations for wars. We are not yet at the place, we may someday be at the place where colonization, that reparations for colonization become a focal point of international diplomacy, but we are not there. I don't know what it would look like if Japan was asked to pay for the cost of colonizing Korea for decades, right? That's a very difficult question to answer. I think political leaders have attempted since 1965, which is when the basic agreement for diplomatic relations was negotiated, to think through problems that weren't expressed in 65 under an authoritarian government in South Korea. The comfort women issue, or the so-called comfort women issue, is one of those issues. There are questions of compensation for forced labor by Koreans and Japanese companies. So there's issues that with constituencies that the Japanese government would like to address, but not necessarily through the mechanism of having formal taxpayer dollars go to South Korea in compensation. I think it's going to take time. I don't think this issue is going to go away. I think it's going to be renegotiated at different moments of political leadership. Now, you asked about Yoon Suk-yeol, who is now indicted for crimes for declaring martial law in South Korea. It has to go through the Constitutional Court. Then there will be an election. There's a certain time period by which, and I'm thinking we've got 60 or 90 days before we get to an election in South Korea for a new president. The trilateral US, Japan, South Korea relationship had been worked on very, very assiduously by all three governments. Biden, when Yoon came in, and then first Kishida, or Suga, and then Kishida. And I think a lot of progress had been made on strategic cooperation. But also, the South Korean president was very interested in thinking about the Indo-Pacific as a place where US, Japan, South Korea could work together. So not just on peninsular defense issues, i.e. North Korea, but also in this broader question of how do we build an Indo-Pacific that is more sustainable and resilient. So I think for the first time, Korea was really stepping out in the regional diplomacy in a way that I think Japan deeply appreciated. So I think there's lots of reason to be optimistic. There's lots of reasons to think that it could quite sharply deteriorate. I don't know who's going to be the next president of South Korea, but typically if you get a progressive leader that comes in South Korea, the issue of Japanese historical memory and compensation again comes to the fore. So it's a difficult thing to predict. I don't know that the Trump administration is going to elevate our strategic cooperation in that trilateral to the level that the Biden administration did, which I think would be unfortunate. But hold your breath, wait and see.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Oh, there's a gentleman here. Oh, there's two gentlemen back there. Can we, if you ask, let them do two back to back, I'll try and answer fast. We're bargaining here. Don't know that I can answer fast. I apologize. It's my fault. Yes, sir.
Populism is a powerful force in the U.S. and also in European politics, and the root causes are usually given as globalization and immigration. I wondered, I don't know much about domestic Japanese politics, and I wonder if similar alignments are made on those issues there.
It's a great question. And I think one of the things for a lot of academics these days is why isn't populism such a big factor in Japanese politics at the moment? Again, you're seeing it, as you pointed out, in Europe and all across Europe, UK, France, Germany, and it's usually expressed at the moment anyway, it seems to be being expressed on the more conservative nationalist side of the political spectrum. Japan has throughout the post-war period had a fairly strong, I'll call it right wing for shorthand, but a nationalist identity politics. It was actually expressed in some ways by Abe Shinzo himself, whose own personal politics tended to be more comfortable in that side of the political spectrum. But as prime minister, he was a statesman and he didn't pursue policies that you might associate with that kind of thinking in Japan. Yasukuni Shrine visits, for example, revising the Constitution, for example. There's a host of issues that are really embraced by many Japanese conservatives, more nationalist conservatives. But I don't think you see the kind of popular in the streets, we want something different, we think the post-war was wrong, we want to recapture from the left or from the right. I mean, you don't get that kind of dynamic at the moment. Two reasons, I think, and I'm just giving you a kind of superficial answer at the moment because it probably requires a deeper analysis. But one is that Japanese are quite comfortable with the consensus that they have built. In other words, you don't have big and huge conflagration between left and right. You certainly have left and right in Japan, but you don't have expressed politics that really don't allow them to find that middle ground. That's one. The second, I think, is, and this is a terrible thing to say because I am of a generation that feels like I am now part of the aging generation. But I think Japanese are getting older. And populism of that sort is often ascribed to a younger generation who want change, who are ready to question assumptions, who really want to challenge the status quo. And I think the Japanese, older Japanese, are not interested in that kind of politics. They may want to maintain and conserve Japanese values, but not necessarily battle them out in the streets. Doesn't mean it couldn't come to Japan through a political leader or a political party, but it's just not, the energy is different there. There was a second question by the gentleman in the red. Yeah, I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
promised and then I completely broke my promise. Go ahead.
Just very quickly,
Yes.
the typical Japanese citizen. Okay, you talked about greater cooperation militarily between the United States and Japan, and bases many places in Japan, Okinawa. I'm not sure the Okinawans are so happy about that.
No.
So could you comment on, how the typical Japanese citizen might see or, react to a stronger military relationship between the U.S. and Japan?
Ask if there are any Japanese citizens in the room. I'm not going to single you out if you don't want to raise your hand. Is there anybody from Japan in the room who'd like to? Yes, would you like to try to answer that question? Just because I think it's wise to ask the Japanese themselves. How do you feel about stronger US-Japan military cooperation? Poor student, is it Sara? We're putting you on the spot, Sara. I do apologize, but I warned you. I warned you in class today. Could you stand up for us? Oh, no, I've really embarrassed you. I'm here with you, I promise. Do you want me to stand next to you? Would that help? No? Oh, there's two. Okay, great. We have two Japanese voices. Go ahead. No, I'm serious. I think it's interesting. It's also interesting. It's a younger generation. Do you have any? How would you respond to that question if somebody addressed? How do you feel?
For U.S. militaries?
U.S. and Japanese military working more closely together. How do you feel about that?
I have some friends, they work in Japanese Defense Forces, and they said connection between America and Japanese military connection is really important, of course, and they can learn a lot of things from American militaries. And Japan has the Article 9, and it said Japan can maintain only minimalized
Right,
forces.
minimal use of force. And
yes, and so some Japanese people thinking Japanese self-defense forces is not enough to maintain the nation or
yep.
yeah. So American military is
Necessary?
yeah necessary, and we feel they are really helpful for us.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. I want a round of applause for that. That's what we need, is more student representation. But I think the important thing here is not everybody will agree. I think you'll have gradations of differences. But I would say for somebody who's looked and watched and written about the Japanese military and sentiment about the Japanese military and the US, I think the Japanese public today, and you can see it in opinion polling, is much, much more worried about the neighborhood that Japan lives in. Much, much more worried about what Kim Jong-un is going to do, especially now that he's paired up with Putin. Much, much more worried about the no limits friendship, Japan and Russia, as you can tell by these military exercises. Russia and China are quite interested in putting some military pressure on the Japanese. So I think the Japanese public is not going crazy, like we have to have nuclear weapons, or we have to. I don't see a massive change in the way that they would like their military to be organized, but they are supporting 2% of GDP. When Kishida announced that in December of 2022, I was all ready for public protests and all kinds of things. Very quiet public response. And I think there's also a deep appreciation for this idea of integrated deterrence between American and Japanese forces. Again, Japan is not a nuclear country, doesn't want to be a nuclear country, but its neighborhood is getting increasingly worrisome. So I wouldn't say every Japanese would agree with what I just said. You do have people who have very strong opinions on both sides. It should be bigger, it should be better, it shouldn't be. The Americans shouldn't run our defense policy, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you find that the consensus in the middle is more populated by people who appreciate the benefit to Japan of the alliance and the cooperation than in the past.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sheila Smith. Two quick announcements for those of you interested. There's a fundraiser at the university supporting students traveling to Japan this summer. There's flyers in the back with more information, activities on Sunday. And then looking ahead, we have at least 3 more events from the Mansfield Center. The first one's going to be Monday, February 3rd, counted out about math and representation in government. And then we'll have 2 more talks, including one about Ukraine and how American democracy got into this mess and how we can get out of it. Hopefully, we can make it that far to the event. Once again, thank you for coming and travel home safely.
Thank you. She did.